By the first week of April 1945, the Western Allied advance had crossed the Rhine and was moving faster than anyone had planned for. The German army in the west was not retreating in good order. It was fragmenting. Whole divisions were surrendering without contact. Roads that should have taken weeks to clear were opening in days. American armored columns were covering ground so quickly that supply lines were struggling to keep pace with the front. On April 11, elements of the American Ninth Army reached the Elbe River. They were approximately 60 miles from Berlin. To the east, Soviet forces were massing along the Oder River. Marshal Zhukov had one of the largest concentrations of armor and artillery assembled anywhere on the Eastern Front. But his forces were not yet moving. The final Soviet offensive had not launched. Bradley's Ninth Army was on the Elbe. Reaching Berlin would still have required major river crossings, extended supply lines, and a costly advance into territory already assigned a central place in Soviet planning. The momentum was still there, but the road was not open. It was simply not yet closed. Whether the Western Allies could have reached Berlin first remains debated. The opportunity to find out disappeared when Eisenhower chose a different objective. The decision did not come from panic or confusion. Eisenhower had been thinking about Berlin for weeks, and his conclusion was consistent every time he returned to it. Berlin was not a military objective, not because it was unreachable, not because the German resistance there was formidable, but because in Eisenhower's assessment, capturing the city would not meaningfully shorten the war. German armies were still fighting in the north, in the south, in Czechoslovakia. Those forces had to be destroyed regardless of what happened in Berlin. The city itself, the government buildings, the bunkers, the symbolic center of the Reich, none of it controlled what the remaining Wehrmacht divisions were doing in the field. From a purely military standpoint, Berlin was a destination without a decisive operational consequence attached to it. There was a second calculation. The Allied occupation zones had already been agreed upon at Yalta in February. Under those agreements, Berlin fell inside the Soviet zone, regardless of who captured it. If American forces fought their way into the city, they would take casualties doing it, hold it briefly, and then hand it to the Soviets anyway, under the terms already signed. Eisenhower saw no military logic in paying that price for a result that the diplomatic table had already determined. Bradley largely agreed. He later estimated the cost of a drive on Berlin at roughly 100,000 Allied casualties. Historians have questioned how formally that figure shaped planning, but the underlying belief was real. Berlin would be expensive, the Germans would defend it, and the city offered nothing militarily that justified the bill, so Eisenhower redirected. The main Allied effort would move southeast, toward the National Redoubt, an area in the Austrian and Bavarian Alps, where intelligence suggested the Nazi leadership might attempt a final prolonged resistance. That threat needed to be neutralized. Remaining German army groups in the north needed to be cut off. Those were the objectives Eisenhower believed would actually end the war. Berlin would fall to the Soviets. On March 28th, Eisenhower informed Stalin directly that Berlin would not be the primary Allied objective. Churchill increasingly feared this was a political concession made before the argument had even been heard. What Eisenhower viewed as military coordination effectively confirmed to Stalin that the Western Allies were not going to make Berlin their primary objective. The argument between them never fully resolved. It simply became irrelevant. Churchill had been watching the map differently for months. Not the military map, the political one. By April 1945, Soviet forces occupied most of Poland, large portions of Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, and were moving through eastern Germany. Everywhere the Red Army advanced, Soviet-aligned governments followed. The pattern was not accidental. Stalin was not simply defeating Germany. He was establishing a post-war order. One city, one capital, one country at a time, and the Western Allies were letting it happen, because the immediate military objective was German defeat, not Soviet containment. Churchill understood this earlier than most. He had been pressing Eisenhower and Roosevelt for months to think beyond the end of the war, to consider where Allied forces stood geographically when the fighting stopped, because that geography was going to determine the political reality of everything that came after. Armies don't just win wars, they define the world the peace gets built on. Berlin fit directly into that argument. A city that fell to Western forces carried a different meaning than a city that fell to Soviet forces. Not militarily, politically. Berlin was the capital of the Reich, the symbolic center of everything the war had been fought to destroy. Whoever took it would carry that weight into the peace negotiations, into the occupation discussions, into every conversation about what Europe looked like when the fighting finally stopped. Churchill believed the Western Allies were surrendering that weight without fully understanding what they were giving up. He pushed back through cables, through meetings, through the chain of command. He argued that Eisenhower's direct communication with Stalin was not just a procedural breach. It was a signal. It told Stalin that the Western Allies were thinking in military terms while he was thinking in political ones. Patton shared little of Eisenhower's caution. He favored continued offensive action and viewed Soviet expansion with open suspicion. He was not directing Allied strategy, but his instinct reflected something spreading quietly among certain commanders, that military opportunities were being passed over, because Allied leaders were weighing considerations beyond the immediate defeat of Germany. Eisenhower did not change course. His position was that military decisions had to be made on military grounds. The occupation zones were already agreed. The casualties would be real. The remaining German armies were genuine targets. Churchill's concerns, however legitimate as political analysis, were not sufficient reason to spend American and British lives on a city that the diplomats had already allocated elsewhere. Churchill increasingly feared he was watching it happen. His concerns did not disappear with the argument. They just no longer had a military option attached to them. On April 16th, Zhukov launched the Soviet offensive from the Oder. The largest artillery bombardment in the history of the Eastern Front opened before dawn. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers began moving toward Berlin simultaneously. The Ninth Army was still on the Elbe. Whatever window had existed in the first days of April had closed while the argument was still happening. The Battle of Berlin did not end until May 2nd. Soviet forces fought through the city block by block. The Germans defending Berlin were not a coherent army. They were fragments, SS units, Volkssturm militia, teenagers pulled from training, men who had no operational capacity left but continued fighting anyway. None of it changed the outcome. It only changed the cost. Soviet casualties during the Berlin operation ran into the hundreds of thousands. The Western Allies watched from the Elbe. American units held their positions along the river while the battle consumed the city to the east. Some commanders wanted to move. The momentum that had carried them from the Rhine was still there, compressed now into stillness, waiting for an order that wasn't coming. A few small American units actually crossed the Elbe, briefly before being pulled back. The war was still technically ongoing. The front was still active. But the decision had been made, and the line held. Berlin fell to the Soviets on May 2nd. Hitler was already dead. The German surrender came 1 week later. The occupation zones activated exactly as agreed. American forces that had advanced deep into what would become the Soviet zone withdrew westward to the agreed boundaries. Territory taken at considerable cost was handed over, not because the military situation required it, but because the diplomatic agreements did. The lines drawn at Yalta became the lines on the ground, and the ground adjusted accordingly. Berlin itself became an island, a city sitting inside the Soviet zone. divided among four powers, accessible to the West only through narrow corridors that the Soviets could pressure or close whenever the political temperature changed, which they did. 3 years later, the Soviets blocked land access entirely. The Western Allies supplied the city by air for nearly a year. 3 years later, Berlin became the site of one of the first major confrontations of the Cold War. The same city Eisenhower had judged not worth the casualties required to capture it. Eisenhower's logic was internally consistent. The occupation zones were already set. The casualties would have been real. The remaining German armies were genuine targets. None of those calculations were wrong on their own terms. What changed was the terms. The borders being established in April 1945 were not temporary positions to be renegotiated at leisure. They were facts on the ground, and facts on the ground in 1945 became the architecture of Europe for the next 40 years. The Ninth Army stayed on the Elbe. The war ended, and the line that American armor had reached in April 1945, 60 miles from Berlin, momentum intact, the road not yet closed, became one of those coordinates that history returns to quietly, without ceremony, when asking whether a decision that made perfect sense in April 1945 looked the same once the Cold War began.